Okay, so welcome to Barry's Book Reviews. This is episode number 27. Today I'm reviewing a book called Arpan by Park Hyoung-su, and translated by Sora Kim Russell. And Park is a novelist and short story writer. I think is most famous for a novel called Nana at Dawn. That novel hasn't been translated into English yet, at least not as far as I know. Park has also translated Park has also written several short story collections, but none of them have been translated yet either. In fact, as far as I know, this is the only Park Hyoung-su story that's available in English. I certainly haven't seen anything else. I guess there might be a short story or two on the internet somewhere, or maybe in a journal or something like that. So if you have encountered other Park Hyoung-su stories, please let me know in the comments. But Park is very well known in the Korean literature scene, and actually won the 2010 Daesan Literary Award. And at least when I last checked a couple of years ago when this book was published, Park was teaching creative writing at a university here in Seoul. A familiar name is the translator. Sora Kim Russell is a professor of translation studies at Ewha University, has translated lots of high-profile Korean novels, including several books by Hwang Sok-young and Pyonhae-young and various other people, and is one of the eminent literary translators working in Korean literature at the moment. And you might have recognized from the book cover that this was published as part of the Asia Publishers K-Fiction series. You might not be able to see, but on the spine it says that it was the second book published in the series, and you can see the rest of the collection up here. Actually, there's been some new books published that I don't have yet, so it's not the full collection up there. But anyway, this was one of the first books published as part of the K-Fiction series, and of course that series includes lots of great stories, including stories I've already reviewed by Park Min-gyu and Hwang Chong-eun, among other great writers. This is a super interesting story. It tackles several big themes, some very interesting ideas, and at the same time it's very poignant and also quite amusing. It centers around a Korean writer who is narrating the story, and his meeting with Arpan. Arpan is a writer, or more accurately a storyteller, from a small tribe in a remote location between Thailand and Myanmar. I'll get to that in a second. So let's talk about the narrator of the story first, right? So who is our narrator? So our narrator is a Korean writer. As a young man, he makes his debut and become convinced of this idea that a true writer, a real writer, should lead a different lifestyle from regular people, from normal everyday people. If you want to be a genuine, authentic writer, you should live some kind of different lifestyle. And as following this idea, he goes to live with a remote tribe in, like I said, in Southeast Asia, I guess near Thailand and Myanmar. And I think it's a fictional place. But in the story, it's called Waka. Nothing to do with Wakanda from the Marvel movies. And he goes there under this idea that he's searching for some kind of transcendence, right? You think about people who go on these sort of spiritual journeys to try and find some kind of enlightenment, right? So he seems to be searching for this, but he fails. He goes there and he doesn't really find any transcendence or enlightenment. Instead, he lives a very lonely life where he helps an old woman, and doesn't really do much else, doesn't seem to find any spiritual enlightenment or fulfillment. But he does meet Arpan in this village. Who is Arpan? Arpan is the local storyteller, and to the Korean narrator, Arpan seems like a natural storyteller. He has this gift for telling stories, And you can see that when he tells these stories, he's filled with genuine joy. And the narrator is amazed by this person, amazed and inspired by this incredible person who seems to be filled with the joy of storytelling, has this natural, abundant gift for telling stories, and loves telling stories. And anyway, having been inspired by this person, our narrator returns to Korea. He leaves this remote village and goes back to Korea. And when he returns to Korea, he makes a very bad decision, which turns out to be perhaps a terrible mistake for his life and for his career. So what happens when he returns to Korea? So he goes back to Korea and he writes several stories based on his experiences living in this small village. He tries to get these stories published, but he's not successful. All of the editors tell him that his stories are terrible, they're no good, and they're not interested in publishing them. So he can't get published. He can't get any of these stories about his experience in this remote village published. Nobody's interested, nobody cares. So in desperation, he takes Arpan's stories. So the stories that he heard Arpan telling, stories that were written in the Wakhan language, he translates these stories into Korean and then he passes them off as his own, which is obviously a disgraceful act of plagiarism. Anyway, this book, it's not his book really, but this book that he's written is a sensation. People love it. He's loved, he's praised, he becomes a successful writer, and of course he feeds off and enjoys this adulation that he gets for writing this book. And as he's the only foreigner, so the only Korean person he thinks who knows Wakhan, who knows the Wakhan language, he thinks his secret is safe. But then, of course, Arpan is invited to Korea to take part in a book festival. And our narrator fears that his secret will be discovered. He'll be revealed to be a fake and a fraud and a phony and a charlatan. And he's terrified that this will happen. And so from this framework, Park uses this sort of framework, this dynamic between these two people, to discuss some very big, ideas and some interesting concepts. So, this is a story about cultural transmission, and what is Park trying to say about cultural transmission? So, if you look online, and if there's some great additional material in the Asia Publisher edition. Park talks about that when he was writing the story, he was thinking about three topics. He was, struggling with or wrestling with the three topics. And first is this idea of cultural transmission. How are cultures transmitted across time? How is culture transmitted from generation to generation? How does culture pass from one culture to another, right? Things that we do in one culture, how do they pass to another culture? How are they taken up by a second culture? Secondly, this is obviously a story about plagiarism, the act of plagiarism. So what is plagiarism? What does it mean? What does it mean for the person who does the plagiarizing? And what is the significance for the person who's been plagiarized, right? And then thirdly and finally, how different is transmission from plagiarism, right? So how do we tell the difference between ideas being transmitted and out plagiarism? And the story is very clever in the way it explores these ideas. And it also explores this assertion or this idea that we must preserve the culture of a specific community, right? We'll often hear this idea that we need to preserve the culture of specific communities, and that seems to be a generally good idea and something that most of us are behind, right? We should preserve the culture of different countries and people and places, especially things that are in danger of being lost, right? That seems like something that most of us wouldn't argue with. But we certainly have that idea. And this story asks, are the things that we call Wakhan from the story, or Korean, or British, or Scottish, or whatever, are those things purely only those things, right? So is something Wakhan or Korean or Scottish, Is it only Wakan, Korean, Scottish, and nothing else? And what does it mean to say that? And the story seems to suggest that when we try to examine origins, if we look at the origins of where something came from, the origins of where culture comes from, the ties or the boundaries of our contemporary communities become increasingly meaningless. And it's it's compelling the way this argument is formulated in the story. What's he saying about plagiarism? This isn't a defense of plagiarism, but he does argue that things don't just fall from the sky, right? Ideas circulate in the world and among people and in cultures, and that art and culture is more fluid, right? This idea of a pure or original concept is actually very complicated. People can come up with similar ideas based on the things that are happening around them at the same time, right? And we find lots of ideas like this that are transmitted through culture and through change and through adaptation. So like I said, the story's tackling some really interesting concepts. It talks about these sort of complicated things and sensitive things, and it does so very intelligently. Also has interesting and unexpected things to say about these issues, and it's very clever, it's very amusing, and it challenges expectations. So it's a story that's well worth picking up. It's Arpan by Park Hyoung-su, and like I said, I think it's Park Hyoung-su's only work available in English translation, so hopefully we'll get some more works by Park at some point in the future. Anyway, this was episode number 27. Thanks for watching, and I'll be back in a day or two with episode 28. Take care.